Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry. That's my music that you heard there. Or not my music. It's the music I'm listening to, produced by someone else, not me. So it's not my music. It's my preferred music. Okay. All right. In continuing the trend tonight, we're going to be working on another branch of government, right? So we're talking about the engineering side of politics and government design, right? So this is the design part of government, and we like to think about the ethics that underlie certain political systems, but we really need to think about the specific designs that are most effective at producing the aims that government is created to produce. And so we just have to ensure that on the design side of things, we're considering whether the design works. We can't regard government as some sort of human institution. It's a system with a specific design for a specific reason. And we need to clearly define what we want to achieve in even establishing a government, right? Why have one, right? If we're not going to be specific about the design, right? We have to take economics and ethics into account and the logistics of whether things actually work, okay? So let's get into it. The thing I'm asking in this video, why do we only have to have one president? Right? Why put all of that power, decision-making power, into one person? How does that make any sense? Right? It's unlike with monarchies, unchecked. Yeah, the president's checked, right? Kinda, but he can issue executive orders and use emergency powers and just become limitless, potentially. If the Supreme Court is packed with his stooges, and the legislature is gridlocked by a fucking bicameral legislature and a binary party system. If he can issue these in times of emergency, he can do whatever the fuck he deems necessary, which is why we had internment camps for the Japanese. I mean, is that not obscene? I mean, this is why we literally vaporized a bunch of innocent children in Hiroshima. I'm sorry to engage in that kind of pathos, but it's a serious matter. It's not a matter of opinion. As I heard in one lecture I listened to recently, it's a matter of life and death, in that case, quite literally. You had innocent children, hundreds of thousands of perfectly innocent people in Hiroshima that were vaporized by a nuclear weapon, right? And who decided to do that, right? Well, in times of war, the president is just considered to be the authority. He's the commander in chief. Why do we only have one? Why? I mean, I get it. In the last video, I said the legislature should be unicameral because it shouldn't check itself. It's checked by two other branches. But I regard the executive as having special powers in times of emergency and distress. And secondarily, we shouldn't have, well, I'll get into this in another video. But I think it's valuable when we're dealing with extremely difficult situations of crisis and distress. We shouldn't just have one person calling the shots, right? Especially as a commander-in-chief, I just don't think it's wise. And I think that in some way we could build a better executive to check itself in a way that preserves not only more quality decision making. In the last video, the founders thought that gridlock produces better quality output. If the system is more deliberate in its production of law and legislation, then the legislation is better quality. That's not always true. The gridlock can generate poor quality action, even if ultimately it generates slightly better quality legislation. We'd have to actually study whether any of that is actually valid. Regardless, I think that it's, I asked the question the other day I was thinking about this. I asked the question, why don't we only have one president? Why can't we, for instance, have three? Why can't we have five? I mean, certainly this country is big, a lot of diverse interests and classes are represented, a lot of different types of ethnicities, different types of cultures. There's no U.S. culture. There are pockets of culture that are somehow assembled into one united front, which is never fully united. That's why we have a party system. The fact that we're even able to fit into these two categories is ridiculous. No one really does, right? And that's why we should really do away with the party system entirely and just elect not on the basis of party, but on the basis of real qualifications. I mean, in my opinion, party is not a qualification. Just because you ally with a specific tribe does not make you qualified to be president, a representative, or a Supreme Court judge. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you've got an IQ of 200. I don't care if you've gone to Harvard. I don't care if you've managed 20 businesses and built 1,000 new innovative technologies and corporations. No. I mean, just being a Republican does not make you qualified. So we need to think better about how we choose these people to represent us, because if we don't, the country is just going to continue to go to shit. It's going to go to shit anyway, irrevocably, because the whole task of trying to manage this big of a nation and this big of a world and this complex of an environment with all of these policy ambitions we have and all of these different interests and issue areas to manage, the whole task of it is ridiculous. And really, that's an argument for not even really engage. Well, no one would argue that, but it's necessary, right? That's an argument, of course, for simply being a libertarian, for reducing government to only its essential functions, to providing basic court, police, and taxation infrastructure, maybe some schools, maybe some roads, but ultimately not much more. No decisions on, if there's an immediate need to go to war. I don't know. So anyway, if there's an immediate need to war with some other tribe, that should be decided by the people, not some figurehead, right? Who would then draft innocent kids and send them over to Vietnam to get their heads blown off. I'm sorry, I'm engaging in pathos again, but it's a serious issue. The way that we constitute power in our society, the people that we imbue power with, we have to be very skeptical of those people and very limited in the kinds of powers that we give them. If we don't do that, we run the risk of history is a story, his story, and her story, right? To be a feminist, it's all a story of, how humans err and ultimately how, those in power err and cause catastrophic consequences for those, though we don't know and can't talk with or see, end up getting completely harmed by those policies. So, no, we have to be very skeptical of the way that we design these institutions, who we give the power to. That's paramount. And why. Importantly, the question of why is ever present here. Okay, so why do we only have one president? Why do we need to have only one executive? Why can't the executive presides over some very critical and very sensitive issues, times of war, times of famine, times of distress, either historical or economic, or some other uprising or revolution. They preside over. The whole nature of the executive is that we need it to act quickly in moments of distress. That's why we shouldn't have separate emergency powers. The executive is emergency powers. It exists so that in moments of distress, some guy can take quick action, lead the whole front in one positive direction, and solve all these issues with one fell swoop. Why does it only have to be one guy? And it shouldn't, right? Yeah, the legislature shouldn't check itself. As I said in the last video, the Supreme Court already should check itself and does check itself because there's an odd number of justices. There are 9. And you have to have a winning vote. All of these institutions, if we want to assume a bicameral legislature, that institution checks itself because there are 2 houses that can war with each other. The Supreme Court checks itself because appeals can be sent down to lower courts, precedents can be ignored, justices can disagree. There's an odd number, so there can be a winning vote. It can come out. These institutions, the legislature and the judiciary, both check themselves. The executive does not. It's checked by the other branches, but it's not checked in of itself, right? If he wants to drop that bomb and the masses are behind him, right? History shows that he'll do it. Will it happen in the more civilized world we know? Probably not. Probably not, right? At least not with that kind of a weapon. We imagine that we're beyond these things. I don't know if we are. I think that definitely could happen, right? I think that the use of drone strikes in Afghanistan and in the Middle East prove that this can happen. These things are still happening. Little isolated and local Hiroshimas are happening whenever one of those drone strikes falls down on a group of children, to kill. So we kill the terrorist, which is only a speculative and remote threat, right? We're going to kill a bunch of children in the process. Whether that actually, I'm sorry, I'm engaging in some pathos here, but these things do happen, right? This isn't this isn't a movie. This isn't a fiction or a book. This is real life, and these things have the way that we institute power and the way that we design systems of power and design them to check themselves effectively determines reality, right? And leads to real consequences, either mild or catastrophic, right? And we have to plan against catastrophes to the best of our ability, and abuses of power especially, and especially not just abuses of power, but misuses of power, either by ignorance or stupidity, right? Because you can have abuses of power, corruption, or you can have misuses of power by stupidity or some other factor, right? I mean, clearly Truman, I don't even know how anyone could make such a decision. I mean, clearly he believed it was necessary. We could debate all of the different questions of that. Clearly, that I don't think that was. I don't think that with the military defense power we had at the time, even if they kept attacking us, I don't even think it ended the war. I think it was just it didn't logistically it didn't have to end the war. It was just us, clapping the boot down and hoping that that threat would keep them from attacking us. And whether or not that worked, I don't know, but we have to measure the costs and benefits. I'm not willing to debate Hiroshima here, and that can be done in different contexts elsewhere. It's not relevant. Clearly, we wouldn't regard that as the brightest moment in human history, regardless. At least that point we can't debate. We wouldn't debate. We would agree on that point. Regardless of where we would agree on disagree or any other issue. I asked the question, why, with the executive, should it not check itself? Clearly, the president has a cabinet. I don't care. He or she makes the final decision. That decision maker needs to be checked in some more substantive way. I don't care if it results in their not being elected. I don't care if it results, which it never does, in their being removed from office. I get that there's a check upon the executive with regard to what? With regard to being impeached? Sure. Yeah, the impeachment threat is certainly a check upon the actions of the executive. He doesn't want to be impeached. But if he's in his second term, right, and the evidence is ambiguous and it's not clear what he did was wrong, the impeachment threat is no threat. And so the executive needs to be checked by more than a cabinet, which are political choices, not smart choices, right? So have the executive check itself. Why not have 3 presidents? You have to have an odd number. If you have an even number, like 2, 5 would be too much. 3 would be fine. 2? No, that's an even number, right? They could disagree and no decision is rendered in the time of distress. You've got to have an odd number so that there can be a winning vote, right? It's fine. Now, why not have 3 presidents? Why do we have 1 president? This is why the executive has to be embodied. Executive powers have to be embodied in a single arbitrary norm. We could instead, now that political commentators and analysts and economists and those concerned with the overall, with this kind of analytics, are concerned with how democratic our country really is. And I talked about in a previous video, the whole idea of a party system directly creates the tyranny of majority problem, which then negates democracy. So we don't even try to be a democracy anymore, and I don't think that we really care about that. We are a democratic republic. I'm willing to concede that. But let's not even call it a democracy. If we've got a party system, it's just a straight-up republic controlled by parties that are elected for less than good reasons. Whatever. I don't care. All right. So why do we have to have just 1 president? Why? Now, I have a solution, right? People have proposed our country is too large, right, to be represented by this one group in Washington. That's fine with me. It doesn't seem very democratic to me either. And if I assume that democracy is a principle that I would want to uphold, sure, good. But, I think that we could have more than 1. We could have 3, right? We could have a tricameral executive. And in that case, the founders thought that gridlock and deliberation, and in this case, it's only 3 people. They have to come to a decision. If in voting, they've got to choose between a discrete number of options, yeah, there could be some logistical permutations here that ultimately result in this not being a good option. I'm more concerned with the fact that the executive needs to be checked very tightly. These decisions they make affect things that we can't even imagine. And investing that power in 1 person, I don't think so. I don't think that's smart. I think power needs to be checked to avoid both abuses and misuses. And so why not have 3 presidents? Now, people have said this country is too large, right, to be represented by 1 group of people in Washington. Fine, have 3 presidents, right? 1 to represent 1 region, another to represent another region, and another to represent another region. We've got 1 president from the West, we've got 1 president from the Midwest, and we've got 1 president from the East, right? And then, of course, the South. Of course, we may need to have, I would say that, yeah, sure, that's fine. We just lump up the East with the South. We're doing this in a vertical fashion. I'm dividing the United States into vertical slices, right? I'm not going horizontally. I'm not saying the Northwest and the North Midwest and the Northeast and the Southwest and the South Midwest and the Southeast. I'm talking about west, including both northwest and southwest, vertical rather than horizontal, right? North Midwest, South Midwest, Northeast, Southeast. And so each one of these presidents would be elected separately by each of these regions. And in that way, it becomes more democratic because for that one executive, it's representing a smaller number of people. Right? I talked about this in the last video. If we're going to have one representative, for the larger the number that one person represents, the less democratic it is, because the less representative that one person is going to be of 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 100,000. The smaller the number, the better, because the more representative that one is, theoretically, right? Based on how the numbers work out. Probably a reasonable assumption. Okay, so we've got the president from the West, we've got the president from the Midwest, and we've got the president from the East. And the way they make decisions is each brain checks the other. Two heads better than one? Well, three are better than two. Okay, I mean, you know, these decision makers each are checked by the other, and it leads to more deliberate executive decisions. Maybe each one of them can even have their own cabinet. I don't care. And then maybe cabinet members are reviewed and approved by a more intricate system that ensures their actual quality, like, inserting experts into cabinets rather than just political apprentices or political appeasers or sycophants like we probably have now, right? No, we need people who are actually smart and qualified in these positions of power. If we don't, that doesn't necessarily mean things will be any better, but it makes it more likely that they will. It at least, we're talking in terms not of certainty, right, but of likelihood. And likelihood is good enough for policy and government. We're never going to reach utopia, right? I mean, this is why economics and policy are dismal sciences. There's no such thing. There'll never be a utopia of any kind. We can strive for that, but with with human nature the way it is, and human need and human want, and managing all of that democratically, and avoiding authoritarianism, and enforcing rights, and observing a bunch of competing principles and rights and everything else, and facts and realities, we just have, essentially, government is just a very controlled mess, just like my bedroom right now. So, contain chaos. I don't know what they call that. Contain chaos, I think, is the word for it. Which is order, right? It's good enough, so it's order. Okay, so why not have three presidents? As I proposed, a regional president from each region, right? They don't get to say that they represent each region. I think that's more democratic. I think that ensures that each one of these major regions, got 50 states, and that's represented by one national government. I mean, yeah, that's fine. It depends on how the national government is. It's got to be a national government, I suppose. Otherwise, it would be separate countries, right? And that's fine too. I'm not opposed necessarily to some states seceding away from, and it just becoming. I don't think necessarily that the United States is worth preserving absolutely the 50. Certainly people are willing. Why can't we subtract them? Okay, I mean, there's no difference. We don't preserve anything, and we don't preserve anything in forcing states to stay in that just don't feel. And I do think that allowing states to threaten to secede is a way of keeping the national government democratic. It keeps them accountable. It keeps them on their toes. It keeps them commiserating and working with those states. If the states can say, hey, fuck you, certainly they can threaten it, but you're going to have more pressure on the national government. I'm not willing to propose that. I'm willing to say that it's theoretically kind of a valuable thing. Might be a valuable thing. Anyway, why not have the three presidents, a tricameral executive, each one checking the other in odd numbers so that there can be a deciding vote? Will it lead to perfect policy? No, but it will lead to a checked executive, right? It will, ideally, logistically, it can't be any other way. Humans are imperfect. Those individuals are going to be imperfect. Why have one imperfect person, right? I mean, to make the decisions. Why not have three? I don't know. I don't know. It doesn't lead to a perfect outcome. I'm not proposing that it does. I'm just saying that it might lead to better outcomes, or at least more deliberate decisions on the part of the executive. Get rid of emergency powers and executive orders and all of these things. I don't necessarily think they're valuable, and I think they're a threat to basic principles we'd want to preserve. I think it's all a result, too, of the inefficiency of the bicameral legislature, which requires all of these enhanced executive powers that then lead to all these negative, potentially negative consequences. So just establish some sort of tricameral executive that checks itself. Three people, three decision makers, right? Then vote between themselves to decide. Two against one. Or maybe they're unanimous. But, that's that. I think the founders thought something like that, decision makers checking each other leads to more deliberate action and ideally better decisions. And if we ensure there are experts in these cabinets, in addition to the checked executive, I think this definitely could lead to better executive decisions. I think we're leading in the direction of a more civilized and just world anyway. I think that I'm an optimist in terms of the historical trajectories into the present, leading into projections about and estimations about the future. Regardless, I think that this is totally possible. I don't think that there necessarily needs to be a single figurehead that we call president that then represents what? How many people are in the US? 300 million? One person to represent 300 million different people? How is that democratic? 3 to 300 million? Is that any better? No, but it's slightly better. It's so marginally better that it doesn't even matter, but I'm not really arguing this in those terms. I'm saying that the executive is created to take action in moments of critical and sensitive distress. And so that branch doesn't only need to be checked by two other branches, it needs to be as possible. And by dividing decision making between three presidents that then vote and decide between themselves and negotiate and consider. And I know that the presidents and the one president and his one cabinet do that already. 3 presidents, 3 cabinets. Is that not better? It does lead. I get that the presidency and the executive is all about fast, rapid action. Let's say if they've got one cabinet and 3 decision makers. I don't think that increasing the number of executive decision makers to 3 over 1 necessarily slows things down anymore, especially when they're in crunch time. Now, the problem is, one problem with this argument is that the executive exists because it's responding to situations of critical and sensitive distress, which are complex. And there's always a time crunch in those moments of decision making, right? The very time crunch there then inevitably leads to bad decisions, whether or not you've got 100 decision makers or 1. But 3 is better than 1, even under that time crunch. The nature of the decisions they make and the choices they face leads to inevitably bad decisions because the situations they're making decisions about are bad. But 3 is better than 1. And it's more democratic. In the regional model that I proposed, ensures that the West is represented by its own executive, the Midwest, and the East. These are very different regions. They don't necessarily all agree, but it's more democratic regardless. And we could partition the country to decide how this executive representation scheme would work. But I think it would lead to a host of benefits, just more deliberate decision making in the executive. 2 brains is better than 1, and by that logic, 3 brains is better than 2. 3 decision makers, odd number, there can be a deciding vote, even in moments of distress that require rapid action. They have to put out a decision in limited time. I don't care if it's 1 or 3. 3 is not going to slow down the process anymore because it can't be slowed down, right? But in that moment of intense decision making under the time crunch that the executive faces, 3 is better than 1. 3 is better than 1, right? Military advisors, cabinet advisors give these guys their information. And then after all that advisement, the executives retire to their respective office and they vote between themselves. That's it. Then a vote is rendered and the executive acts. That's it. Tricameral executive, right? So as an extension of this series, I'm arguing for a unicameral legislature and a tricameral executive, right? Because I recognize there's the need for odd numbers when making critical decisions. You have to have a deciding vote. Okay, so continuing this series, unicameral legislature, tricameral executive. That's what I would propose. I will leave it to the audience to debate the legitimacy of those particular propositions. They could be total shit. I'm totally willing to take. I will very happily accept any criticism of any of this. This is mostly just me trying to engage in an engineering design mindset with regard to government and policy, which is the proper mindset. It's not a political decision, right? It's an engineering one. It's an economics one, right? It's a policy one. It's a little more complicated than politics. We may have our own judgments about whether God is real or not. We may have disagreements over what defines marriage and how sex has a role in that definition. We may have disagreements about whether climate change is real and whether war. We may have disagreements about these things, but if we have defined our terms correctly and are thinking economics mindset, can come to certain agreements about what logistically works, right? They say that math is a universal language, or that music is a universal language. I would argue that economics is kind of the same way, right? And in the same way that we can engage in computational engineering and computers can make decisions algorithmically based on quantification of values and whatnot, computers make decisions all the time that are most efficient and most optimal. With regard to optimality and with regard to efficiency, we can all agree. And I think if we define our terms correctly and adopt the right mindsets, we can come to agreements about what works, even if it makes us uncomfortable ethically, which is secondary, frankly. We have to ensure that things work. And then we can consider whether or not. Now, we have to integrate principles and ethics into that. I completely acknowledge that. That's why I've assumed that democracy is valid. But it's a little more complicated than just enforcing a principle. We have to reconcile our ethical principles with economic realities. And by applying these analytics mindsets, we can generate better government and better policy if we can trust each other to agree on what's basically logical, which I think that we can. I think we can make propositions that are inarguable. I think if we use the right terms, propositions can be inarguable. And there is a universal language to logic that, when applied to policy, really makes the whole process much easier. We cut out the fat and keep the lean meat. And this is the approach that we have to have going into the future. The inefficiency, the government shutdowns as the result of petty politics, all of this needs to go. It's an offense to everyone. It's an embarrassment to other nations that still have their own petty debates. But we need to compromise our ethical principles between each other. And if we can't, we need to collectively decide to democratically reconcile at the national government level those principles. But if we can't reconcile them, leave it to the states. Okay? I mean, for things that we can't agree on ethically, right? We shouldn't be legislating religion anyway. There's a separation of church and state. I don't care if you think life starts at conception, that's fine, right? Certainly a certain type of life starts at conception. Whether it's a human life is debatable. And I don't want to get into that. That doesn't matter, right? I'm not even sure where I stand on the whole pro-life, pro-choice thing. But regardless of your feelings about these specific issues, if we want a national government and a nation that works together cohesively, cooperatively, generates workable solutions to the problems of normal everyday people and to the world, and of advancing human progress, then we have to compromise on certain ethical principles. If we don't have a compromise mindset, nothing can happen collectively. And it's fine. Compromise is only an option, not a necessity, right? If we can't compromise, then we need to figure out a system where we can break away from each other so that one majority is not imposing its will on one minority. I would regard that as wrong. And why fundamentally, and this is exacerbated by the party system and everything else, if one group of people feels a certain way, right, let them stand alone, enforce their principles, and then let the rest of the world happens. We insulate. I mean, we need to, in some way, this may be too large a nation, right, to be represented by one national government. And I think it is in terms of population. I think the United States was a great thing and is a great thing in principle. There were some very intelligent design ideas behind it and underpin it now. It has potential, but it's not perfect at all. And I think the greatest form of patriotism is ultimately criticism. And I am engaging in a criticism mindset here, even if I have conceded the value of the system itself. But if we can't reconcile through compromise within a country this large, bifurcated rigidly by party lines, we need to break away from each other. And we at least need to leave to the states to decide things that we can't reconcile nationally, right? In that way, we can preserve the national government and use federalism for its advantages. Let the states enforce their own will on whatever policy or another, if it's based on pure ethics and not logic. And that's fine. We have our ethical principles. In some way, ethical principles sometimes are just assumed valid, even if they can't be defended logically. Ultimately, I think everything can be defended logically. But that's just a matter of your personality type, and and I'm willing to commiserate with all types. But at least on this matter, leave it. If we can't reconcile something nationally, This is why we have separate state governments. Let the states be laboratories of democracy. Leave certain things to the states. Let them enforce their ethical principles. And let's see how it works. Let's see the consequences. Why not? I mean, that's one of the advantages of the federalist system, right? We're not just a national government, we're a conglomeration of state governments. Let each one of these little countries enforce its own policies, and let's stand back and observe what works and what doesn't. And in that way, we preserve the advantages of federalism, which I think that is the advantage of federalism. And it's also why I would argue against a one world government. One, because a one-legged table, if you knock out that one leg, it's going to fall. That's the same with a one world government. If you've got different governments and different unconnected systems, if one falls, that's fine. The rest of the species is okay. But if a one world government falls, you're fucked. I mean, in some way. It just leads to disorder everywhere and complications everywhere, where if one country falls, that's fine. It's much worse if the whole world falls. But it's the same principle with having a federalist system of different states. We're not just one United States. We are the united separate states. We're united, but we're not together on every issue. Nationally, leave it to the states, let them be laboratories, and let's just see how their policies work. If we honestly can't, the evidence isn't clear, the ethics aren't well defined, the economics is a bit ambiguous, the logistics is seemingly unworkable, which it really is. But if that's the case, let the states try. If they fail, we know what works and what doesn't. They succeed, we know what works and what doesn't. And that's not always good enough. I mean, history is not evidence absolutely. And things work or don't work for one reason or another, and you have to get more intricate into your analysis. But from this standpoint, we can reconcile. We can recognize that there is value in having separate state governments all united into one, and leaving federalism to itself and letting the states function as laboratories of democracy for things that we truly can't reconcile federally. Leave it to the states, and let them destroy themselves if they want to, or let them succeed brilliantly, and then we can say, oh, that works. That seems to work. Okay. That's not making a very complex point. Video, I'm not talking about any of that. That kind of goes off on a bit of a tangent, although it's somewhat related to some of the concepts I've raised. I'm talking about a tricameral executive, right? And I've already laid out my reasoning for that. So again, continuing this series, I would propose the unicameral legislature and the tricameral executive. And this way, I think, where decisions shouldn't be so deliberate, right? In the legislature, doesn't need to be that deliberate. Eliminate that house, put experts into the process, increase efficiency and the generation of output with quality, with the role of experts, with the abolition of the Senate. And then in the executive, we actually need way more deliberation because the issues the executive covers are far more complex, far more sensitive, and far more critical and far more life affecting. Okay, so we need more deliberation in the legislature. And okay, with criticisms, and I'm happy to try to reconcile my point of view, my perspective with those rebuttals. And if I can't, I'm totally willing to drop this proposition. It's just to offer a potential engineering solution to some of the problems in government. Thank you.